I'm David Wilcock, and this is Wisdom Teachings. Is there an equivalence between the frequencies of sound and the frequencies of the visible light spectrum, as in the colors of the rainbow? Do these frequency changes also map over into the structure of biological life? Are there scientific facts showing us that biological life is a crystal that comes out of some deeper underlying frequency manifesting as geometry? And do we have absolute proof that you can in fact transform one species into another using these frequency changes? That's what we're going to explore in this episode of Wisdom Teachings. We have been going through a radical re-envisioning of what most people would ever have thought they knew about science and spirituality and the point where science and spirit meet. This was the forbidden territory in which the church said, let us deal with God, and you scientists can deal with the rest of the universe. But then they made it into a dead universe, and that's the sort of unholy deal that was made at the time of the Renaissance and the Reformation. And it's not really fair, because now that we're seeing that there might be a seed that the whole universe was created from, we have to fundamentally re-envision this idea of a dead universe. And look at the psychological problems that so many people have. Look at the pervasiveness of loneliness, depression, anxiety, fear, anger, sadness. Think about how disconnected we feel. Think about the fact that there is no consensus in the scientific community that we will live when we die. My own grandparents on my father's side, basically, when it really came down to it, did not necessarily believe that they would be conscious after death. And when I talked to them about this and tried to feel into what they really thought, there was the sense that death makes you cease to exist. And when I would try to psychically tune into that, it was as if an all-encompassing blackness takes over. You fall asleep, you never wake up, and your identity is gone forever. That is what science has tried to make us think. And what I'm saying to you is actually very profound. I'm saying the most powerful people want you to think that way because it benefits them and their agenda. It allows them to fundamentally deny your eternal existence. You can go to religion for answers, you can go to spirituality for answers, but then you got to come back around to science, and science says, sorry, you're not anything. You're just going to die and turn into rotting meat, and there's no greater level of who and what you are. Well, I don't believe that, and I hope by now you don't believe that either. And what I'm trying to do here is heal this massive wound that has existed for 400 years, at least, in our collective zeitgeist psychology, in which, if you go over to science where everything is real and everything is provable and institutional and credible and academic, then you got to get rid of all this spiritual stuff. You can't interface with it anymore. It's gone. But all we're seeing now is that it's a problem of publicity. The science that tells us the truth is not getting publicized. There's credible people with medical doctorates, PhDs, who are not ever getting to be heard. Their science is being swept under the rug, and we are not getting the truth. And that truth is very, very interesting, because it not only tells us that life is a product of a conscious universe, but the implications are that life can evolve by nothing other than frequency, and it can do so not in the boring old Darwinian model of random mutation, where maybe after a long time, someday, some random thing will happen where this little guy grows an arm out of his chest, and now he can kick ass, and he can kill better. So he has kids, right? Because now he's the alpha male, and then the kids have the little thing, and they start killing and kicking ass. The next thing you know, everybody's got it. And that's the so-called random mutation model of evolution. It's about survival of the fittest. It's about who's the best killer. And this is exactly what the elite believe about themselves. They are the most evolved because they are the most ruthless. They have essentially siphoned off the wealth for themselves. They are trying to dramatically reduce the population here on the planet. And they're doing so with the belief that they are better than us, that they are gods among insects, as they themselves have said, and that they somehow are more worthy of the fruits of this earth and of the universe than the rest of us. Well, I don't believe that either. And what I'm saying is, if you really want to get down the rabbit hole and get red-pilled, what you find is that these people have really gamed the system. You don't get a fair shake when you look at science. They control the peer review process. They control the advisory boards. They control the journals. They are pruning what they don't like. Think about a plant that has flower buds on it, and if there's certain buds that you don't want to grow, you clip them off. So what I'm actually saying, and yes, if you want to call it a conspiracy theory, you could. I would call it a conspiracy analysis, is that very substantial efforts have been made from the dawn of science for this group that we've often called the Cabal, some people call it the Illuminati, to penetrate into the voice of the collective, the voice of the scientific fact. And they will get in there, and if you go against the grain, you get your funding cut off, you lose access to research grants, your colleagues will peer review you and tell you, oh, this just is not right, and then all of it gets swept under the rug. And what I'm saying is this has been done very deliberately, and so what we have is a manicured, artificially deleted view of science in which all of the good stuff about spirituality and eternity and the soul and the power of love, all that stuff is removed. And what you're left with is this really lame view that leads to what happened to my grandparents, where they think that they're just going to melt into blackness when they die. That's not true. It's something much greater than that. And now we have all the tools we need to show us this. So, very brief review here. We showed how the whole universe starts with a Merkaba shape. It's crystallizing out, and it looks like this shape in the middle of this little guy here. This is a drop of water with sand particles in it. And when it's not being vibrated, it just looks like muddy water. But all the mud magically turns into geometry as soon as you play resonance into it. In this case, specific diatonic frequencies, diatonic meaning the white keys in the piano, the purest sounds. The sounds that sound good to our ear, because ultimately the number of vibrations per second is divisible into many different units, like 360 vibrations per second. You can divide 360 into 180 and 180. You can divide it into 90, 90, and 90, 45, da-da-da-da-da. There's all these different ways to chop up 360 into even pieces. So the amount of harmony in a number is the amount of different ways you can chop it up into equal sets of numbers that all count up to the same thing. 360 is a great example, 432 is a great example, and there are many others like that. So the idea here is that the universe did not start with a Big Bang. It started with a big flowering out of a seed. And again, the geometry, don't think of it as a physical shape or a physical structure. Think of it as a wave pattern of resonance. Now, up until now, I've always been talking about resonance and vibration, but I'm also talking about photons. And that could get a little bit confusing. Because, wait a minute, David, sound frequencies are at a much lower level than light frequencies. So you would think. And that brings us to Dale Pond. I actually got to meet him at the U.S. Psychotronics Association conference back in 2000, and what he has there is a resonance-generating device. You'll notice there is a spherical, brass-like shell there that's on a harness, and it looks like it probably rotates because there's an axle there. And then notice also that below it is what appears to be piano strings or guitar strings, but they're thicker than a guitar, and they are on these tuning pegs, and they're in a grid relationship. So clearly what he's doing here is making some kind of resonance device. Dale Pond told me a very fascinating and tragic story, which was that he was working on some of these exotic technologies, like free energy, that kind of stuff. And he came home one day and found a single burnt match left in the middle of his carpet. It didn't even burn the carpet, it was just a burnt match left on the floor in his house. And he told me this, and I could see the anxiety and fear in his eyes as he was telling me this story. Because nobody else came in and out of his house. The house was locked. There was no evidence of a break-in, but he got the message. And the message was someone went into his house, left that burnt match there as a warning to him, saying we, whoever we is, will burn your house down if you keep working on this stuff, if you keep working on this exciting, groundbreaking, and disruptive technology that disrupts the power system. So I was fascinated by that, and actually I was very excited to meet him because by this point I had already read his book, The Physics of Love. This is the cover of The Physics of Love, at least my version of it. There's other newer versions that have a different cover, and it says The Ultimate Universal Laws by Dale Pond, Edgar Cayce, John Keeley, Rudolf Steiner, Nikola Tesla. So what that means is he's quoting from these different thinkers as well as writing it himself. And The Physics of Love talks about a very fascinating concept, which is the direct equivalence between sound and light ratios. And I'll explain what that means in just a second, but it is fascinating. Well, just the title alone is very provocative, The Physics of Love. Most people wouldn't think that love is a physics or that there is a way to measure love as a physics. But if you read material like The Law of One, it gets really interesting because the idea is love is what makes people attracted to each other. Love draws people together. Love is an attractive force. The Law of One material, which again, in my view, is the best that there is, says that this is gravity. That love is the tendency for all objects in the universe to want to attract to each other and reunify. So now we have a redefining of physics in which love is the main force that we see acting on all bodies in the universe. It's gravity. And that ultimately the universe will coalesce back into a wholeness, which is love, a loving reunion of all of the separateness in the universe right now. Ultimately going back to that one primordial seed that I said everything came from. Now what Dale Pond did is truly amazing because he analyzed the mathematical relationships between the white keys on the piano, which I said is the diatonic scale. And I was talking about those pure numbers, and I was talking about how a number like 360, you can go 180 and 180, 90, 90 and 90, 45, 45, 45, 60, 60, 60, 60, 60. Yeah, I think there's 6 of them, right? All these different ways to divide it up. And then you have to look at the difference between one number of vibrations, because remember, a sound is simply how many times air is vibrating in 1 second. That's all it is. There's nothing really there, it's just air, and it's the way the air vibrates. It's how fast the air is vibrating. That's what makes your ear hear sound. And this is a big, big part of ancient alchemical teachings and ancient mystery school teachings, this idea that there is a relationship between the rainbow spectrum of colored light and the sounds of the diatonic scale and geometry. But that's something that we got from ancient extraterrestrials, if you will. That's what it appears to have come from. It wasn't necessarily provable, but Dale Pond actually crunched the numbers. So what you have to do is look at any 2 numbers in the diatonic scale, what's the frequency, and then you start doubling it, doubling it, doubling it, and bringing it to a much higher level. Because ultimately, what we're seeing in the visible light spectrum is a series of ratios, except in this case, instead of vibrations of air for sound, you have vibrations of light. But there are literally, in the electromagnetic spectrum, as you know, the visible light portion of the electromagnetic energy is very, very small. You have ultraviolet, you have infrared, you have microwaves, you have all these other frequencies outside what our eye can see and determine to be color. But color is very interesting because we're built to take in color. Our eyes are built to see color, and we don't see ultraviolet, we don't see infrared, but it's there. And there are obviously equipment, things that we can build that'll do that, like night vision, which uses infrared and allows you to see in the dark, because infrared is a lot more visible in the dark than visible light. So my point in telling you all this is the idea that there are going to be ratios between the colors in the light spectrum. In other words, blue is going to have a particular resonance, it's going to have a particular number of vibrations, in this case of light or electromagnetic energy, per second. And then the color next to it is going to have another ratio, and another ratio, another value of frequency. And the differences between 2 slots in the rainbow would be a ratio. So here's what Dale Pond did that's so amazing. Check out this chart. Notice at the bottom, I'm going to help you understand this. You see at the bottom you got the letters. And it's C, E, G, D, B, and F. Well, these are notes in the diatonic scale. Obviously, we don't see A there, but we do see the others. Those are actually the sounds that we get when we are looking at the frequencies. So notice C has the number 256 above it. The note C is 256 vibrations of air per second. Then he notches up E a little higher, and he takes it up to 1280 vibrations per second. That would be like a higher octave of E. But again, you could hear that if you had the right equipment. 1280 cycles per second would be a high pitch. Then notice he's got G at 768 cycles per second. He's got, again, a higher level of D, might or might not be above the level of human hearing at 2,304, B at 1,920, and F at 2,816. Then notice on the left-hand side that you have this y-axis where it starts at the bottom and it says fundamental, and then it says first, second, third, fourth, and it goes all the way up to ninth. And then notice at the top, he's got it up to infinity. And then notice also that inside the colors, you have different relationships between the notes which correspond to these chord relationships. So you have the fourth, the major third, major seventh, the fifth, the minor third, etc. And of course, when you're working in music, you have to build chords out of those types of relationships, and the basic chord is a triad, which is any three notes in the diatonic scale next to each other, is one of the most basic ways to do it. And then you analyze how they fit together, and when you play those three notes at once, you get a chord. Or you could do it with more notes as well. So what's so fascinating is that Dale Pond crunched the numbers of the pure vibrations and the ratios between them, and he notches it up higher and higher. And then what happens is that he discovered you get exactly the same relationships as the vibrations in the rainbow spectrum. That's right. There is literally a perfect connection between the sounds of the major scale, which sound right to our ear because they're the most harmonic, and the colors in the rainbow. Now this is huge because, think about this, all this time that I've been talking to you about all this science, and I talk about the geometry, I say sound frequency, I talk about the water, I say the geometry appears in the water because you're beaming it with a sound frequency. And I've been saying to you that you can change the frequency and you change the geometry. Well, now Dale Pond has showed us that literally, as you make those same frequencies go higher, and you simply take that vibration, and instead of vibrating air, you vibrate electromagnetism, right? That's the only other difference. It's just energy now, but you're vibrating it at a certain frequency. Boom! Now you have the colors of the rainbow. So that means that you can create the same exact frequencies. The geometry is color. And that's huge. Because what that also says is that you could have photons at different frequencies. You could have photons, of course, that make blue light, red light, green light, yellow light, etc. And that's the color that we're going to see. It has to do with what frequency does the photon have. Now this is where it gets into the law of one. It gets really strange because the law of one talks about the idea of true colors. And it says that the visible colors we see are really more of a mirror of colors that have the same vibrational relationships, but that we can't see with the naked eye. And so there's this idea that as we move into a higher dimension, that there are photons that go along with that higher dimension. And so our Earth, according to this material, we are moving into a new zone of energy in our solar system and our galaxy that's changing the sun, changing the planets, and it has a higher frequency, which they call true color green. That means new photons are coming out from the sun, and they have new frequencies in them. And again, this model of biology that I've been giving you really takes a digital view of the photon. What do I mean by that? I mean that the photon is an incredibly vast information storage medium. All of the things that I've been telling you about this science only make sense if a single photon can have an entire genetic code wrapped up inside of itself. Now they're very tiny, that is true, but the idea here is that within that tiny shape is geometry, and we talked about that before, and it's not just a very plain geometry, it's got a very precise note, a very precise frequency, a very precise fractal shape, and it will hold that shape even as it travels trillions of parsecs through space, arguably. The light that we see when we look at the stars in the night sky is not new. It's been traveling for millions of years to get to us in many cases. It's old. But those photons carry their genetic signature the whole time. Light is alive. This is one of the things it says in so many esoteric traditions. And what I'm saying is, think of the photon now as if it's like a USB stick, and it's got all that memory inside of it, trillions of gigabytes. And that memory is enough. Well, I would assume it would be that much. Maybe it's not quite that much, but it's a lot. A huge amount of information can be stored in this very tiny mechanism, and that's really how the universe is built. So once we take that fundamental assumption, all kinds of really cool stuff starts to crank out from it. And this again gets back to our DNA phantom effect, where we have been showing now that DNA, which remember now is a geometric pattern, it's a dodecahedron that the double helix wraps over, the DNA with that dodecahedral resonance will take all the light in a little room and attract the light into itself. And then even if you remove the DNA, the light still stays in the same pattern for up to 30 days. So in the Russian science, that's called latent vacuum structuring. It means that even in seemingly empty space, you can create a wave pattern and it will stay there for a long time and continue to do work. And this is very different than conventional physics. But again, the key is DNA is hungry for light. It's absorbing light. It wants light as much as possible. So if light has the genetic code stored in it, then when light goes into DNA, you could actually transform the DNA from one species into another. And that's what we're going to show by the end of this episode. So I want you to get the model here. The idea is, forget about the DNA for a minute. Forget about trying to think of it as a double helix and a physical molecule. Think about it as a wave pattern. Think about those dodecahedrons that's like a totem pole it wraps over, and think about the idea that that is just a resonance. It doesn't have any physical structure. And then think about the idea that all of that resonance could be stored in a photon. That's the only way that we can explain these strange things that are happening. There's a geometric aggregation going on. You remember when I talked about microclusters? That these little atoms, you shoot them out one at a time, and they end up wanting to bunch together into geometry. No extra force is required. This one on the left is what happens when 459 atoms are shot into a little room. They all want to do this. They join together into this weird shape, and then there on the right with 561 is your icosahedron. So again, there's no special trick here. If you had a tennis ball shooter and you shot a bunch of tennis balls into a tennis court, at the quantum level, all those tennis balls would bunch together and make shapes like this. And the reason why they do that is resonance. That geometry is all around us. There's always a vibration around us, whether we know it or not. And it takes all the particles, and it says, you guys are coming together now. And as I showed you before, it changes shape as waves go through. So this is the same cluster of 460, but there are ripples in the current. And again, one more review for you real quickly is the fullerene. This is 60 carbon atoms. You slam it against a wall, and it turns into a wave. So they're 1 nanometer wide, and they go through this diffraction grating, which is just like a slot. And then when they hit the slot, they turn into a wave, creating this interference pattern. They're no longer solid particles, but if you wait long enough on the other side, they turn back into little buckyballs again. Now that's really strange, and that's what quantum physicists call wave-particle duality. We like to think of them as particles, but you can do things to them and make them into waves. And the buckyball is about the same width as DNA, so therefore DNA can phase into and out of a wave shape. So we're used to thinking of the DNA as a crystal of hard little particles, but those, all you got to do is thump it with your finger, basically is what they're saying, and the particles can turn into a wave. And once they're in a wave state, they could be affected by frequency. The wave could change, and then it'll crystallize back into DNA again, but it could be something else. So that's the really cool part. This was performed again at the University of Vienna in Austria, and the idea here is that what you see on the left can turn into what you see on the right, back and forth, very easily. Now I want to talk a lot more about Luc Montagnier. He's the Nobel Prize-winning scientist we've covered in previous episodes, but never like I'm about to do now, because his experiment is so unbelievably amazing. What he was able to do is show plain water developing DNA by strictly being bombarded with energy. That's right. There was no DNA in the water. He zaps it, and life creates itself spontaneously. And if you didn't believe how serious this is, maybe now you're going to take a second look. Here's another picture of Luc Montagnier looking at a tube of water, and he has had some very interesting discoveries about that. And his discoveries, this is from his material now, look at that. He's got a drop of water and he's showing the geometry inside. So he is very aware of the geometric component of what he would call information storage that actually happens inside water. This is all consistent with what we've been talking about. This is the classic diagram of his experiment. On the left, you have the tube that says DNA, and that means there's little pieces of DNA in water that's hermetically sealed, so there's no way you're getting in there. And then on the right, inside that can, if you will, you have tubes of plain water. Now notice that there's that blue series of coils wrapped around the two. You got DNA water on the left and plain water on the right. Then notice at the top it says generator 7 hertz. That means electrical energy. You zap it for 18 hours, and DNA grows in the plain tube of water. And that's really, really bizarre. It doesn't make sense, but it happens. And so this is where we're going to start to bring in some heavyweights so you see how far this has gone. A very important quote comes to us from the theoretical chemist Jeffrey Reimer from UC Berkeley. As I like to say, when you see somebody in front of a chalkboard with lots of equations on there and he's from a place like Berkeley, you know this guy is serious. And in fact, here's an older picture of him when he was younger, and you see all the credentials he's got. He's the CBE chair of the Warren and Catherine Schillinger Distinguished Professorship in Chemical Engineering, and he's got focuses on material chemistry, applied spectroscopy, alternative energy, and nuclear spintronics. Wow, it's a lot of stuff. He is quoted in this paper, Scorn Over the Claim of Teleported DNA. This is in New Scientist, January 12, 2011. Now here's what's interesting here. Dr. Luc Montagnier did actually get to present this fascinating research at the United Nations, but there is such an intrinsic bias in the scientific community that most people simply could not handle what he was saying. It's too far outside the box for them. But Dr. Reimer was not among that group. So he makes a very important quote that you can see right here in the New Scientist article. And they say Jeff Reimers, they actually put the S on there. There is no S. But I'm going to zoom in on his quote, which is there at the bottom. If these results are correct, these would be the most significant experiments performed in the past 90 years, demonstrating a complete reevaluation of the whole conceptual framework of modern chemistry. Wow. So this is a major accredited scientist from Berkeley saying this is the biggest and most important thing we've seen in 90 years, and we have to completely start over what we thought we knew about chemistry. So what I've been giving you throughout this 5 years I've been doing this show now, more than 5 years actually, by the time you see this it'll be probably closer to 5.5, is a unified view that starts to explain this. You do have to rejigger the way that we look at the quantum world, and resonance and frequency becomes so important. And here's another quote from Reimer. He says, the experimental methods used appear to be comprehensive, meaning this is not fluff, this is not pseudoscience. He takes it very seriously. I'm going to get into now the exact nature of how this experiment worked. It's a little bit more complex than I've said before, but I want you to have this. It says after 16 to 18 hours, both of the water samples were independently subjected to the polymerase chain reaction, or PCR, a method routinely used to amplify traces of DNA by using enzymes to make many copies of the original material. So bear in mind right here, you have to have DNA there, or you're not going to get more DNA out of it, right? All the PCR reaction does is it takes what's already there and it allows it to grow. It's basically feeding the DNA the amino acids it needs to make more of itself. And this is a common thing they do in biology. It's akin to culturing a biological specimen, in this case a DNA specimen. But they're culturing a drop of water that didn't have any DNA in it at all. So how the heck could you culture DNA out of something with no DNA? Well, you get DNA anyway. So let's keep reading. The gene fragment was apparently recovered from both tubes, even though one should have contained just water. And again, they refer back to this diagram. Somehow they're culturing out DNA, which suggests that tiny amounts of DNA were in there, and you give them some food and more of it grows, and it becomes very obvious. Now here's the key. DNA was only recovered if the original solution of DNA, whose concentration has not been revealed, had been diluted several times before you put it in the magnetic field. If you have too much DNA in there, it doesn't work. In each cycle, it was diluted tenfold, and ghost DNA was only recovered after between 7 and 12 dilutions of the original. It was not found at the ultra-high dilutions used in homeopathy. And that's a little side we can talk about for a second. Homeopathy is where you take something that is actually toxic and dangerous to the body, like belladonna, and then you dilute it in a solution so much that no molecular trace of the original material is still there. and the X determines how many times you've diluted. So 10x, 100x, these are very high dilutions. There should be no material of that toxin left, but yet the water seems to have a memory of the material so that when you take it in, it stimulates your immune system. So if you take something that would normally make you break out with a skin rash and you dilute it down, now it makes your skin more likely to heal from a rash. It jumpstarts your immune system. And homeopathy has a long-standing science behind it. Luc Montagnier is very interested in this, but you don't have to dilute anywhere near as much to get the DNA, in this case, as you do with homeopathy. Now, this is interesting because what I feel is happening here is if you have too much DNA in the tube, then it doesn't have enough water. The water is important to resonate the DNA. So what I actually think is happening here, remember, DNA, as we learned before from Dr. Fritz Albert Popp, DNA stores 1,000 photons in each molecule. They're binging around in there just like a fiber optic cable. So if there's 1,000 photons in there, and then when you break the DNA, they come out, they could be stimulated, those photons could be stimulated to release by magnetic and electromagnetic energy. So you could magnetize it, you can give it this electromagnetic stimulation, vibrate the DNA and cause some of those photons to shoot out. And those photons now have, as I've been saying in the digital biology model, the photons have the code of the whole DNA molecule. Each photon has the whole code. It shoots through space. Some of those are going to hit the tube next to it, even though it's sealed. They get into that water, and they start telling the water molecules to go into a wave state, and then in the wave state they change and they reform, and they start attracting each other and making little pieces of DNA, which you can amplify with the PCR. So I believe the photons are the key. This again is the digital biology, the idea that the photon has the genetic information that we need to make an entire DNA molecule. The photon is a resonance, and the DNA is a resonance. The DNA is a dodecahedral pattern. We talked about Glenn Rhine and how it zips into a torus shape, which has geometry on a larger level. So it's all resonance. And resonance is not just sound, it's light, it's color. The colors of the rainbow have the same ratios between them as the sounds. So photons can change vibration, which means that the genetic information in them could also change accordingly. Despite the skepticism over Montagnier's explanation, the consensus was that the results deserved to be investigated further. Montagnier's colleague, theoretical physicist Giuseppe Vitiello of the University of Salerno in Italy, is confident that the result is reliable. And here's Vitiello. This is a photoshopped picture of him, kind of very trippy looking. And here's another shot of Vitiello, of course, in front of the obligatory chalkboard with equations on it. And we're just going to read a little bit more of what he said. I would exclude that this DNA that we find in the tube has anything to do with contamination. It is very important that other groups repeat this study. So we are looking at the possibility now that this DNA reaction can transform from one type of DNA to another, because look at it. DNA formed in water where there was no DNA. So when we get into the next episode, we're finally going to start to unlock the science of how one particular life form could be changed into another one in light of all the knowledge that we now have. This is what all of my work telling you all this stuff has been building up to, because it's one thing to grow DNA out of nothing. It's quite another when we start taking existing species and transforming them into something else. We're going to begin with Montagnier and show how he's done it, and then we're going to take it into the realm of Russian science, and possibly also a Korean scientist as well if we have time. That's all coming up in the next episode of Wisdom Teachings, bringing you the information you need that will set you free. Thanks for watching.